Thank you so much for coming along to this seminar today. Before we launch in, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the unceded land of the Awabakal and Worimi people today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And so today we're very fortunate to have Professor Paula Pustulka joining us all the way from SWPS University in Warsaw, Poland. So Paula is a sociologist whose research focuses on interdisciplinary studies of youth and generations. And her work focuses particularly on gender, family choices, and migration and mobility trajectories, looking at how they shape transitions in individual life course experiences and from a generational perspective. So Paula also directs the Youth Research Centre at her institution, where she's overseeing a range of grants and projects around young people's lived experiences in Poland and abroad. So yeah, without just more kind of too much ado, I will go to Paula to talk about navigating ambivalence in becoming an adult during polycrisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Welcome to everybody who is here and who's joining us on Zoom. Let me also take this opportunity to help Julia Cook so much for organizing it and generally inviting me to Newcastle. It's been very productive. We still have a week left and I feel like we're making good progress on our cooperation. So I'm going to try to speak for about 30 minutes. This is what I've set on my timer because I would really like to get some feedback. This is very much work in progress. And I feel like the title already indicates that this is a work in progress in the sense that navigating and ambivalence and becoming an adult and adulthood and the polycrisis are already very big themes. And while they have been explored in conjunction, they sort of kind of make me think more and more than I work with them that they might not be fitting for a standard 8,000 words article. So any proposals on how to focus, how to narrow, how to streamline this paper would be very much welcome. Okay. So my presentation is quite standard. There are 4 parts. I have theoretical framework and the research question. I will talk a little bit about the study and methods. This project has been ongoing for a few years, so I would also flag things that are actually ready from that project so that if you're interested in them, you can take a look. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my preliminary analysis and findings and what I've discovered when looking at the ambivalence of adulthood during polycrisis. And instead of, or in lieu of conclusions, I more or less have some preliminary notes and thoughts that I would like to talk about in a little bit of detail. Okay, so the research question and what I'm working with conceptually here is how do young people experience and navigate ambivalence of adulthood during polycrisis? So we sort of have this multiplication of crises as a given, as a context. And while I think that experiencing ambivalence would be sort of fitting to talk about in terms of how it's there during polycrisis for young people, I feel that what makes this paper a bit more, I think, challenging is that there is the studies of ambivalence in young lives kind of stop at the point of like, oh, there is ambivalence, we recognize it, we have to deal with it, but there is way less saying about how do young people deal with it. So what do they do about this ambivalence? And if they are living in this constant sense of uncertainty, how does that in the longer term translate into their lived experiences? So my theoretical framework is very much rooted in sociological ambivalence. For those of you who have not worked extensively with ambivalence, a lot of it came to sociology from psychology, where in psychological research, ambivalence is very much something bad. It's a problem. It's something that we need to resolve in order to move forward. So anytime for psychologists there is an ambivalence, they try to find ways to eliminate that ambivalence for like a healthy outcome. For sociology, for longer, already since the 1960s, ambivalence has been located in social roles rather than inner life. So we think about how our roles as customers and as sellers in the original piece, but also family roles and work roles are kind of containing those elements of mixed feelings. How do we feel about them as we go along? And what sociological ambivalence offers is that we can sort of observe and track how people continuously seek to reconcile. In the most common application of ambivalence, it's about those two levels of societal operations. So something that is individual, what I do, what I think, what are my motivations, what are my aspirations, and something that is external to us. So it might be social structures, it might be social norms, it might be social pressures, it might be values, it might be preconditions of getting somewhere. So then we in researching ambivalence, we're kind of interested in those contradictions that are engendered by social structures but manifested in individual actions. Lots of research or lots of work that I've done so far with ambivalence focus on reproductive ambivalence. So you can think about it very clearly as I have mixed feelings about having children. The society tells me that being a mother will be so rewarding, but the labor market is telling me something else. It's going to be harmful for my career, and also my personal experiences feed into this. So I have those contradictions of before I take actions to think about things through. So ambivalence is created at this interface of sort of social structure and individual agency, what I can do versus cannot do. It may, through individual actions, also be sort of like a precondition for social change, but it doesn't have to be. So when we experience ambivalence, there are sort of those three main outcomes. We can continue to live with ambivalence. We can decide we reproduce the social orders and sort of push our own personal desires sort of to the background, or we can go for our wants and needs and motivations, which is something that happens when we, and that will sort of generate social change. So a lot of intergenerational change is actually about ambivalence, because young people would challenge something that they have inherited in terms of norms and values and think about their own paths. And if there's enough, sort of critical mass in those thinkings about the alternative paths, then we can see social change and new social patterns. For studying adulthood, I'm thinking about ambivalence very simply as those mixed feelings that people have about adulthood. So people might think that, might have those mixed feelings, those contradictory feelings, both about adulthood as a social concept. So they might say, well, I don't care about adulthood, or I am aspiring. This is something that I want to grow up. And we see this when we look at the life course, that very young children and then adolescents, they will always say, oh, I want to grow up so fast. And then it sort of stops and we're kind of changing our attitudes to adulthood. We might have a bit more ambivalence about it. We might not welcome it so much. But it is also the second plane where ambivalence happens in terms of this individual realization. So we have this discursive, imposed, and interactional concepts of adulthood. So things that our parents told us about what we have to do in order for them to see us as grown-ups, or things that, have to happen in school in terms of formal things, like getting, a driver's license or turning 18, that are those markers that society sort of thinks that are important for adulthood. And then we might filter them, and they might stand in contrast or in agreement with our own personal views on what we should or shouldn't do. And when they are not aligned, this is where the interesting things for sociologists happen. So to understand ambivalence of adulthood, I would propose that we need to kind of look at those three interrelated, overlain or cumulative levels. So it's never that we only think about adulthood in this personal sense of subjectivity and don't account for what is happening in the broader social structures. So on the micro level, we have the individual narratives and practices of adulthood. We have the ideas about ourselves, this doing of adulthood, what we're actually practicing. Then there is a meso level of interactional constructions, for example, the intergenerational narratives, visions, and pressures. And then those are the macro concepts that come from normative order, rooted in the social legitimization of adulthood. It might be in politics, communicated as such. It might be in policies and in discourses. So we're looking at the ambivalence also as something that is much stronger when there is social change. So when there is quick social change, when there is much dynamics in social life, the ambivalence might be something that is more pronouncedly experienced simply because those conflicting areas of meso, micro, and micro are having those more tension points, right? So there's not only, as it used to be, so some of the reproductive ambivalence literature says that in the past, the social change was enabled by ambivalence because it was acceptable to the past generation for their offspring to go from having 3 kids to having 1 kid. And then when those things moved along further, so it's not 1 kid but no kids, or it's not no kids but pets, or not even a significant others, then those points of ambivalence kind of multiply in those mesospheres. So yeah, we're always kind of producing, trying to produce some sort of order in our unstable and uncertain existence, but it is getting much harder when there is more issues that come about and cause this chaos. And in youth research, a lot has been done in sort of connection to ambivalence. The very sort of crux of youth research when we talk about subjective, objective, transitions, cultural, combining the frameworks, emerging adulthood and psychological frameworks and sociological big 5 from the 1970s and so on. This kind of also yields itself to adulthood, to ambivalence, because we have definitions of adulthood that kind of combine those very more or less ambivalent ways, right? So on the one hand, you think about adulthood as very structured, as aspirations to settle down, you have a house, you have a partner, you're married, you have a child, you have a stable job, you're graduating. So those are very institutional markers. And it's not that we've just abandoned them. It's more about like that we combine them with the newer ingredients of growing up centered on self-development. So this sort of thinking about what you want for your adulthood is kind of sitting between those kind of 2 discourses and cause this ambivalence of like, how am I going to make sense of this? There is some research that says that we see how young people strive to concurrently follow the traditional path. So a lot of people still aspire to have a husband, wife, have a children with that one person, and so on and so on. But they also contest it. So this is kind of the interesting part of ambivalence of like, what do you do when you are at the same time for something and against something, and you have to work with it. So we have also some research that talks about ambivalence indirectly in terms of this being an interactional accomplishment. So even though we talk about individualization and how, oh yes, you make your own way and you decide yourself, not really. We still know that young people are fed a lot of the norms and values through socialization models, through their parents, and those achievements of adulthood are also contingent on social class. So this is also when those ambivalences may appear. And there is the concept of semi-adulthood. So you're partially an adult, and we can discuss very long what that actually means. If it's this semi-independence, so you live separately, but you're getting the money. If you have a partner, but you're not married, and so on. So there's this inherently ambivalent concepts. And there is also some work on ambivalence in thinking about global versus individual futures. So you've worked on this. So I've really liked this idea about like that there is the sort of two tracks when we, on the one hand, see this ambivalence between, I see the crises, they are somewhere, those structural big things, but I'm doing my thing. So there's this interplay of like, I know that there is a climate crisis, but in my daily life, I'm still going to like pursue the job that pays and so on, not really paying that much attention to having a green career. So there's some work on that. And recently, there's more emerging work in the relational sphere. So how do people negotiate the multiplicity of attractive alternatives? So you want to partner, you want to be in a committed relationship, you want to have a stable relationship, but at the same time, you know that around the corner, on your phone, on the Tinder, that was sounded very generationally wrong, on Tinder, like there is something that might be better for you. So how do you manage this ambivalence of like, on the one hand, the society tells you that you should strive for greatness and find your soulmate, but at the other hand, you want to find stability and settle down. So this is the key concept, conceptual framework. Very quickly, just for context, in terms of what's happening in transitions to adulthood in Poland, because they are quite different from what I think we know from Western scholarship. And I think the biggest regional differences for the Central and Eastern Europe lie in the fact that we are still very strongly influenced by Big Five. So the Big Five markers that you kind of can think about it in the long view perspective. So between 1944 and 1989, Poland was a satellite state of Russia, so to say, and we had a communist government that essentially just planned everything for you. You didn't have to think about what you're going to do with your life because it was the government who decided if you're going to go to university or not, based on their class ordering of people. It was the government who decided if you're going to get an apartment or not. And same went for education. So let's say when my parents finished university, they were essentially sent, this is where the jobs are, this is the flat you're getting, this is where you're going to live. There's very little sort of agency in this. And also people knew that, for example, like to get a bigger flat, they had to promise that they will have children. So there is really lots of involvement of state in this institutional transition that that the people would have been going through. So state was very involved in monitoring those institutional markers, and there was very little interest. Sociology was basically almost exclusively quantitative, and there was very little tracking of like what people actually think about it. Like, yes, we knew that they don't like it very much, obviously. They would like to have a different system, and that's how we had the transition to democracy in 1989 and then throughout the 90s. But those are kind of the models that the parents, and especially and also the grandparents of the young adults that we research today, this was their experience. This is how their transitions looked like. So there was very little ambivalence in how they've been going through that period of becoming an adult. So then what happened in the 90s, we had very, very quick catch-up period. We wanted to be like the West very, very quickly without very much regard on like how this can be implemented quickly, which essentially meant that we had a very rapid transition from this very traditional Catholic, structured way of life, collective even way of life, to this post-materialistic values, very quick laicization, and very quick this acceptance of neoliberal approaches to life. So people started socializing their children very strongly in this American ideal of the American dream. There's meritocracy, you have to work hard, and things are going to happen for you. So there was very, very strong acceptance of this. And now, in the 2020s, we're ending up with chaos. There's really very strong sense of hybridization of values. There's coexistence of both those very traditional visions and life paths, because many people want to reproduce what their parents have had. And look at their parents as this kind of role model for aspirations. But on the other hand, there is lots of value ambivalence and lots of progressive ideas. So people have been at the same time socialized with this Americanized view of you can do anything and you can be unique and you can construct your identity. and this very, very strong notion that by the end of 30, all those things, the 5 things better be there, because otherwise, so there is this sort of ingrained ambivalence almost on what are you supposed to do. And adding to this is the polycrisis, which we see as a cumulative effect of unsettling events, so those political and transformative, disruptive political events that have the potential to disrupt previous life projects. So unsettling event framework that we work with very much is essentially saying that when something like the Brexit or EU accession or global pandemic and so on happen, then those things will trickle down and will have potential to change people's initial ideas. So it might change your aspirations. You may no longer think like your parents, and so on and so on. And we also argue that crises for young people in Poland are becoming more of that daily life than they might be for other contexts, and I will have some slides about this. And I think I would flag here that one of the things that we have had in recent years is that just by the end of the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine started, the full-scale invasion started, and we've been the country that has been receiving the most Ukrainian refugees, which meant that Poland, which under the previous state governance was a very homogeneous society, has had to tackle this influx of people who are different very quickly. So, and just to make it clear, so like up until like throughout the 90s, we were 96, 98% white Catholic, and this has been changing very, very rapidly. And the third thing here is that I feel like it's probably something different to talk about this war as when we are as close to it as Poland is, in the sense that, again, in our generational memory, Russia has always been an aggressor. We are extremely afraid of Russia. It's like this big brother who can at any time just invade us and destroy us very quickly. So throughout the region, the threat of Russia is very, very perceptible. And like, just to give you an example, so like, I think for many of the European nations, the war in Ukraine is kind of now sort of in the back of their minds, especially with Gaza crisis and so on. In Poland, we have drones flying over Poland. We had civilians killed accidentally because some bomb accidentally fell on the wrong side of the border. So we kind of live with this, the war is really being next door, and we have to sort of think about those things. Right. So the study I'm talking about is called Ultragen, Becoming an Adult in Times of Ultra Uncertainty, Intergenerational Theory of Shaky Transitions. It's been going since 2020, was supposed to end in 2024. We extended it a little bit. We're going to finish it in a few months. It has several components. From almost each of these components, we have by now published a little bit. So if you go on Google Scholar, search my name and Ultragen, you would probably find some of our findings that we've already published. We have a book coming up early next year. However, it's in Polish. Sorry. And I'm mostly using here the qualitative, longitudinal, and multi-perspective research that we're doing as our sort of main qualitative component. This is its research design. It might remind you it's very eerily similar to what Julia's doing, because we have young adults and their parents. So our young adults are 18 to 35. Their parents are mostly in their 40s to 60s. We had 70 individual in-depth interviews, so 35 diets at wave 1. And then we came back to them twice. So yeah, today I'm talking primarily on young adults because adding a multi-generationality to this already very full setup would be too much. So they are here in red. So in wave 1, we've done 70 dyadic interviews. 35 of those people were the young adults. In asynchronous wave exchange, we've had 20 of them, and then 26 came back for wave 2. You might be wondering, what is this asynchronous one? It's essentially that we were running our qualitative longitudinal study, and at wave 1, we told our interviewees that we will come back to them if something happens. And if nothing happens, then we will come back to them in 2 years for the regular interviews. little did we know, the war started. So obviously within 4 weeks, we started asynchronous interviews, and we were quite uniquely positioned to kind of get lots of good data or early data on like how people think about the war in Poland. Okay, I'm looking at time. This should be fine. Should be. Okay, so for my preliminary findings, when I started working with this data, I was thinking, okay, so how do I kind of make the points with, let's say, more powerful sort of slides and quotes and so on to address both the experiences and the navigation of adulthood during polycrisis. And I feel like the problem of this analysis, I think, starts when I try to go to the navigation. So we see how they experience it, but it's very difficult to kind of observe how they cope with it. So I've kind of tried to focus on this because I feel this is kind of unique for the ambivalence research. Lots of research on ambivalence just says, and ambivalence is a given. It's this postmodern, you know, sort of Bauman's thinking of like, oh, it's always going to be there. But I'm more interested, okay, so it's always going to be there, but how are you going to deal with this when you want to also like sort of transitioning to adulthood? So I decided to give you one slide from our survey, just one, to give like a snapshot of quantitative data. And this is our data on fears and concerns of young people in Poland. And I feel like this in one slide kind of shows that, yes, they really think that there is a polycrisis. So they are essentially incredibly concerned. This is 2023, so the same time as we did the survey. Those numbers have not changed very much. There has been some shifts, and actually people getting more scared of Ukrainian migration. So at this point, we were still quite welcoming. Now there is quite a bit more skepticism towards Ukrainian migration. And a lot of the other numbers for example, for access to public services, economic recession, climate, Russian attack, they either stayed the same or they've went up. I'm using the 2023 because that's also where the qualitative data is from. But this is the context of like where my interviewees are sort of situated. So they're in a country where a representative sample of young people from 18 to 35 are really, really tremendously concerned, either very concerned or somewhat, or, you know, concerned about all those things happening, and they see it as realistic. So when you correlate with how realistic they are really kind of seeing this crisis in their daily life. And I've just put one quote, which kind of says that like we don't really have to debate that there are those two narratives. So those things that I was initially inspired by with somewhere out in the world, there is the war and maybe there's climate change, but this is my life. They don't have it. They really, for them, those two narratives of polycrisis and my own life have really come together. And all of them really reflect on those massive events. We don't have to talk, we don't have to probe them for it. When we ask what is happening in your life, they are already talking about this. Like in the first sentence, war started and recession and inflation. And we also, you know, we had like one of the highest 17% inflation in one of the years recently. So there's really a lot of those things. So this idea that I had, okay, so they will have this like distant track of like world is going, getting worse, but I'm going to try to manage. I thought this was going to be the main kind of tension and this ambivalent sense of I have to sort of live with those big structures, but this is my life. This is not the case. They really are sort of embedded in this crisis reality, and something that they talk about is that they have not expected how much those multiple crises will trickle into their lives. So here you have Bartek, who already at wave one was very concerned. He was just about to move out, but then the pandemic happened. He couldn't. He struggled in online education. He broke up, or his girlfriend broke up with him. So there was really a lot of those shifts in his life. And he kind of sums it up saying that, like, I never imagined that those large, very scale movements globally could change so intensely and so profoundly affect my own private life. So a lot of them have this strong narrative. So where is the ambivalence? So what I found are essentially 4 narratives that I see where those issues of polycrisis, navigating and experiencing ambivalence, and adulthood are connected. The first is kind of quite expected. It's this idea that I'm going to deal with ambivalence by simply not thinking about it and delaying anything that I can delay. And I'm giving two quotes here where both interviewees, they are both women. Paula is 19, Veronica is 31, and I specifically also added Veronica because Paula sounds like a 19-year-old. So it is kind of expected that she will say, I think it's hard to feel like an adult when you live with your parents. And she says she has those flashes when like she's driving a car or she's sitting at the box or like in a cubicle at work that she's like, oh, I'm so grown up. But then it like passes and she again feels very immature. And she says that pandemic made it nearly impossible for her to get there, to get to being an independent adult. She also talks about like those internalized fears that she struggled through pandemic with. And she just says that since I can't leave home, I guess I'm just postponing adulthood for now. And surprisingly, this is very much similar to what Veronica says. And Veronica, ladies and gentlemen, she has a husband and a child. She has her own company, but she lives at her parents' place. And her parents really do help her materially, financially, because her business was very affected by the pandemic. And she kind of still hasn't come back. So we're here at wave two. It's 2023, but she still kind of has not bounced back. And she talks about like that she's not feeling necessarily like an adult yet. And for her, adult is someone who is responsible and orderly and takes care of everything. And she does not do it because she would not get the money for anything. And she talks about like, I live with my parents and with my child and with my husband, and sort of the whole financial responsibility over the house, organizational, logistical, the responsibility over the household is not hers. It's somebody else's. She does not feel this. And she kind of also talks in the rest of the interview that she doesn't feel, it might happen. So here, her and her husband, they're thinking maybe we will buy a house, but they're really not sure and they don't know when. So there is this very strong delay narrative. The important thing I think here is also that even here, for very young people young adults who have been socialized arguably with those new models, they really refer very strongly in Poland to those traditional markers. So there's very strong persistence of this narrative of the institutional transition. So you might do almost everything, but you're still not an adult if. And then it's enough that you don't meet this one sort of arbitrary criteria for you to struggle to have an ambivalence about adulthood. So this shifted towards unspecified future. The second narrative, which I think is very sort of, again, rooted in history, is this kind of, when there is misalignment between the ideas and the capabilities, they kind of take on this, like, I'm going to soldier on approach. And they talk at length how during communism, it was also hard. You never knew what the state will decide for you. So I kind of have to also deal with this. And how they narrate it is that you just kind of, we have to, as young people, be those martyrs and go through it. So yes, it's very hard because I hate my country. It doesn't give me anything, but I also am trying to get, and I hope that it gets better. So this ambivalence of impossibility of becoming an adult is also kind of shifted into the future, but it's more about the grander narrative of like, this is how it's always been. I have to pay my dues and I have to kind of get there. So there's this strong, I guess, intergenerational feature to this when they talk about the pandemic delayed job searches. I cannot move out. We would like to go together, live together, but I feel like I have Bartek talks about, I almost gave up because one has to constantly fight against this front wind to live a normal life, but we're not giving up. So it's this tension between, do I want it? I have to just like get through it. And it's same for Camila, who has moved out. She lives with a partner, but they've been in crisis mode for the last 9 months since she moved out, because every month they have trouble paying rent. Her partner lost a job or had like very turbulent experience on the labor market. She had trouble in her education. And she talks about moving back home, that would be easier. but that would be a failure. So for her, sort of this move towards adulthood is very important. She wants to be independent and she wants to be a real adult. So she just says, well, eventually I hope it's going to get better. And somewhat similar is this neoliberal self-narrative, which I found, I think this quote really gave me pause. So here we have Karol, who indeed, he comes from very disadvantaged background, from working class family. And he says, I'm tired of this snowflaking. And he underscores even twice that I come from nothing. So of course I'm shocked about the prices of flats, the appalling job offers that my friends talk about it. So he also recognized that becoming an adult is very hard. It's very, in those structural terms, made almost impossible. And he is, very critical and says, especially after the pandemic, because the hordes of Ukrainians flooded the market. So he's also very skeptical about like the political discourses. But then he says, but I'm a proof I can do it. And he has this very strong toughen up. Yes, I have mixed feelings about it. I don't know if it's achievable. I'm sitting at this context of, I don't know if it's possible, but I am going to just toughen up and be my very financialized self, and I will try hard enough so it can happen. And so at the end, he also expresses, because I've read this story, and in the beginning, it's like, oh, he's very clear, there's very little ambivalence. But at the end, I think it's interesting that he says, it can still not work out, because I don't know, the next wave of migrants comes and I get fired, but at least I've tried. So he has this like mentality of like, I'm going to deal with this by trying and by toughening up and applying myself and so on. And then the last kind of counter narrative to is, it's like this very deeply sort of not even embracing ambivalence, but working with it. And those are the narratives that often talk about like, it's gotten so hard with the polycrisis and with the ideas that I've had about growing up that I needed work because I was confused about my own identity. So Marek here at 25, he says, I wouldn't be surprised if I were 40 and still didn't feel particularly grown up. From a relatively objective perspective, so he's even using those external structural markers, I could basically say right now that I won't be any more grown up because I'm not planning to have a partner or children. I'm reticent about climbing a career ladder. So he's really sort of hanging his own adulthood, and he's a climate-driven anti-natalist, so he's very like active and so on. But he's experiencing a lot of social pressures from his parents, from his environment. It's not a sort of life path that is seen as something. So everyone is saying him, oh, it's going to pass. Like you're going to want different things. And he says, no, I'm very confident I'm not. And he says that he essentially just has to work through it in therapy because that's how much he feels conflicted. And he doesn't know if he should see himself as an adult or not, if he wants to see himself as an adult or not. So there is a strong culmination of this normative value chaos in professional, personal paths. And this is even more strongly coming through in the narrative of Zofia, who says, I was like on my way. I was becoming an adult and I was so happy about it because I was graduating, I was getting my PhD, was going to get a job, I got married, had a flat, and so on. And then she says that the pandemic and then the war really kind of intersected with this to the point of her feeling like she's regressed. There was this moment of suspension, and then she had a breakdown. She had like a complete breakdown and said that she had trouble making decisions about the future. She didn't know she had this moment of fragility, and now she says, I'm no longer sure what kind of adulthood I want, or if I want it. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. So there's this continuous ambivalence, and she's asking, does a pathway for me even exist at this point? So there's kind of this unresolved ambivalence when there's a self in crisis that sort of in structural terms that comes together with this crisis of the self, of like, on individual level, I'm not sure who I am, but also the structural conditions are also telling me you're not going to get a job, you're not going to meet those criteria because of how the society is currently organized. Right, and instead of conclusions, because I feel it's I'm very out of time. So I would say that there is really little separation between crisis or polycrisis in those personal experiences of transition and possible futures. So those crises are very, very close to our interviewees. We see that I feel this is kind of like this, we're at the tail end of the social consequences of this very rapid value normative change. Young people simply cannot really successfully work through it because the pressures from the structures to succeed and from their parents to do adulthood the certain ways are just sort of too difficult, especially when they are also trying to reconcile them with those post-materialistic ideas and values and individualization. So polycrisis in Poland seems to really underpin the transitions. And we see this in those contradictions between very rigid social structures situated at the generational level of institutionalized transitions and those individually manifested capacities for actions which are very limited. The agency is very low. So I'm really, kind of interested in exploring how can we sort of think about ambivalence as sort of this lasting tension, but not only something that can be sort of good for our identity and cause like, oh, reflexive, I'm so reflexive, it's helping me to deal with things, but also that in certain contexts like polycrisis, they might have produced those very sort of difficult, turbulent transitions and identities for young adults. Thank you.
Okay, this is on. Thank you so much, Paula. Fantastic. And now we can go to some. Pardon?
You can probably close this, no?
Yeah, yep, sure. Or I'll minimize.
Leave it up.
Okay, yep. So yes, now we can go to some questions. So any questions in the room to start with? And just keeping in mind, I need to bring the microphone over to you. Right. Yep. Any questions?
So yeah, I've got lots of questions. So a lot of evidence seems to be against two-track thinking. Yeah, because I think the paper from 2010 about two-track thinking was a result of the methodology. Now that I reflect on it, more than the actual maybe mindset of the people in that. So that's just one thing. But in saying that, in research that we've just done about fintech, in our initial survey findings, we're finding a little bit of a two-track thinking going on as well, where we've asked young people about their own futures and the financial future, and whether they're going to be able to buy a house and whether they're going to be able to afford to have kids, whether they're going to have good superannuation and be able to retire well. Most of them are on the positive side. On the other side, we ask them, are politicians going to look after you? Is climate change going to screw you over? Is the world getting better or worse? And they all say no. And then, so there's still that kind of two-track thinking, but it seems to result from the methodology more maybe than, and I think what you have in your data is like a much more complex and relatable thing between those two tracks that expresses what's really going on in terms of the ambivalence rather than a kind of oversimplistic dichotomy, I suppose. Is that what you think is kind of happening there as well?
I think I definitely do, because I feel like also when I'm looking at the data longitudinally, this comes out that like at the pandemic, there's more like of this, like, oh yes, there's this war. I think one of them even talks, oh, in Australia, they just had a fire and I'm so worried. But it's not like something that they then integrate as like, oh, I'm concerned about climate affecting my life. It's affecting the planet, but not me. But then by wave, like the last wave, because of, I think, the war and the inflation, they really bring it all together. So like even like the very distant crisis somewhere, like there was a storm, I think, on Rhodos just before we did our wave, and there was like some natural disasters. They really talked about it as something that they will be impacted by. We try to ask how, but they simply say, I know I will be, because EU and this is how those things work. So they really see it as interconnected, which is very interesting.
Thank you. My question was about, were there any of the young people interviewed who were giving an opinion, positive or negative about the notion of becoming an adult? Wasn't that a concept for themselves already imposed on them, becoming an adult?
I think the only ones that did were still the ones that kind of came from very stringent backgrounds, in a sense that there was a lot of moral and social control in their house and community. So if they, for example, had the very strict parents that would control like how they spent the time and what they did and so on, they would later talk a little bit more about the appeal of adulthood. But this was definitely like rare in this study and decreased in comparison to a study that we've done like between 2016 and 2020. So more of the young adults in the earlier 3-wave study were talking about, yes, adulthood is sort of this freedom, and when I become an adult, I can decide. The parents cannot tell me what to do. But in this study sample, this was almost not present. I think it was only like a couple who said, oh yeah, it's good because I can like manage my own things. And if this came up, it was just this very like daily life. Oh, I'm happy that I can choose my own vacuum. So no, so like they were almost kind of sarcastic about it when we asked. And I didn't put that quote ultimately, but I remember a woman who is 26. She's quite well positioned. And we asked, so how do you feel about adulthood? And she's like, it's terrible. I feel so overwhelmed by everything. And like the only nice thing is that like I can decide that I'm going to like get appliances that I like in color. So that was like, and I don't see anything other positive about being an adult in a current reality. And they also often talk about how this was different for other generations.
I got another quick question. Yeah. So I moved to this slide here. I know you were presenting the broad stroke data about ambivalence and stuff generally. In this one, it's like a very masculinist kind of. I'm tired of snowflaking. I've got myself a wife.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I like it. Yeah, yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the gender dynamics that's going on?
Yeah, we have. I think that we have the same problem as a lot of countries when there is a tremendous ideological gender gap. So we have a marital market where there is a problem because the women are urban, very educated. The men are less educated and they stay in their places of origin. And on top of that, we have a revival of all those nationalist, masculinist movements coming from also that are also present in Sweden and in Germany and so on. So we have a lot of this, and we've seen it in the last election when there was a huge, sort of discrepancy in how young people voted in terms of gender. Men voted very conservatively, and I feel like men in this study were more likely to sort of embrace this neoliberal narrative because I think they just kind of did not experience the same pressures. And for them, I feel it was easier to manage those traditional kind of narratives, like getting myself a wife. And he, like in other parts of the interview, he kind of clearly says about like his wife is going to stay with the kids. Like he's not going to do anything, have anything to do with that. So his transition, he's going to meet all the criteria, but they're kind of like almost buffered by the fact that a lot of it is like taken on by women, by his wife, who does all the care and cleaning and domestic things and so on. So he can fully focus on building a house and being a good worker. Yeah, the women I think were less likely to say things like this, although they were also quite financialized. So we were writing a paper on housing, and there's one who says like, I wish I can go back in time 20 years so I could buy the house, and now I want to have a promotion. And they also gamify, this one in particular, she gamified like the motherhood allowances, in a sense that it is in Poland possible to like stop working early in the pregnancy and then do something else on the side to get like a bit more money. And she like did all that. She also pretended she's a single mother to get a preferential mortgage. And yeah, so there are also those. Yeah.
Very interesting. So we have a couple of questions from the chat, which I'll read out now. So to begin with, from James, thanks, Paula, for a really rich and interesting presentation. I'm wondering if any of the participants have reflections on their role as activists or citizens capable of producing collective change in relation to the polycrises, and whether these ideas are connected to ideas about adulthood or not.
Not in this sample, but I'm really kind of feeling that activists in Poland are very different from our Gen Pop young adults. And I have a friend who is doing a similar study, but I know that also from the adulthood is kind of blurry here, because we've done a study on young adult activists, and they did have like this very sort of complex relationship with adulthood, because on the one hand they talked tremendously about how being an activist and being like a citizen that is active, that is taking part in different actions, is kind of making them feel more grown up because they feel like they're in a public sphere. But they also talked how activism is a very marginalized social context of employment and earning money. So a lot of them would say, yes, I feel like subjectively that it helped me, but at the same time, it really set me back, because my friends who did not become activists, they went corporate and they were able to quickly earn the money so they could have a down payment on the house, and they could have a wedding and so on. And I'm kind of stuck in this like space when I'm kind of making a difference, but my parents still constantly ask me, when are you finally going to get a real job? So I think they had a very complex relationship with activism. So I would say with adulthood and activism. So I think it's very interesting question. I have to think about it more. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a question from Julia Coffey. Thanks so much for your presentation. It's really compelling to hear about the compounding effect of polycrises for young people. It's also interesting to think about the sense of effective recognition of these crises and proximity or temporality. Crises seem sensed and anticipated. This seems like a primary feature of young people's lives today and comes through so clearly in your presentation. So Julia's particularly wondering if you'd like to respond to the kind of sensed aspect of crisis.
The sensed, like the
felt.
The felt. Yeah, because I think that this is something that I've struggled with personally in this data, because I am, I'm not a psychologist. I have little background in sociology of emotions. I had to kind of get more background in sociology of emotions and sociology of fear. And we have been working a little bit more with this literature stream, because I think it's just so important. And I feel like we have not started this study thinking that we will be needing to tackle with like really deeply personal like sense of, my mind, my body, everything is kind of linked and affected by polycrisis, because they do also talk about polycrisis in the context of health, not only mental health, but also physical health. So I feel that there is a lot of these bodily experiences that we have not yet worked through in the data. And I feel like the sort of sociology of emotions, like I said, we've worked with fear, and we're planning to kind of work with other emotions and maybe try to see if we can sort of think about not only sadness and lack of agency, but also something a bit more lighthearted and humor of adulthood. So I think there is a lot of to be done about the emotionality of the data, but it has been challenging. And for sure, it really helped that at some point to our team, we've added an academic who has a background in psychology, and she read couple of transcripts, came to a first interview, a project meeting, and she's like, this is about well-being and emotional well-being at that, and this is how we're going to conceptualize it. So they are working on this, so like the sensed and felt emotional aspects of crises. So yeah, if I'm pretty sure that this paper is coming out soon, the well-being and sense. Yeah.
Fantastic. One to look out for.
Don't let the psychologist.
No, she's writing with a sociologist. It's fine.
Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. I had maybe just in somewhat connected to Julia's questions before, like in terms of sensation of it, like in terms of how do they get information about this polycrisis? Where does the information come from? Is it just like, did they say anything about if it's like, endless scrolling? And also, is there any pushback in terms of like, I'm stepping away from news and all that stuff because it's too overwhelming?
Yeah, we've asked because we have an entire block of questions on like politics, where you stand, and also how do you get your information? And most of them are social media fed. But I have to say, because we've done in one of the components, the Twitter one, we've also done a Twitter analysis of Polish Twitter data on polycrisis and adulthood. And this should be coming up soon in Journal of Youth Studies, I want to say. Yes. And this basically kind of showed how like present it was, that like polycrisis, crisis, war, young people, inflation, housing crisis, all of this was kind of like in the media all the time. So they talk about this being like this primary channel through which they are fed, and they kind of like also almost echo some of the things that you would read in the media. Like we asked them, so like, how do you see your generation, like your peers and yourself? And they kind of sometimes even like use the headlines, and then we ask, what do you mean by that? And they elaborate. But I feel like we've had a couple that said, especially between different waves, that I cut down and I do not follow news. However, and I specifically remember one who was like, I was so depressed with the news, so I've decided I'm going to be healthier and less affected if I don't do it. But then she said, oh yeah, but then there was Christmas. And like around the family table, everybody still talked about this. And everybody kept asking me, like, what are you going to do with this terrible situation on the housing market? Or like, what are we going to do about the Ukrainians? And so on. And, the Belarus border. So I feel like there's no escape. And like they kind of feel like this, that even if you try to take yourself out of those negative like crisis narratives, it's just very difficult to stay with it kind of and try to think positively or like not see it.
Thank you.
Great. So I think we're pretty much at time, and yeah, so we can finish up here. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Paula.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And thank you, everyone on Zoom, for joining us today.